Fantastic. We're good to go.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea. I'm here with the Community Language Cooperative. We're going to be practicing language justice and creating a space where everybody can hear and speak in the language that they feel more comfortable in. We're going to have simultaneous interpretation in English and in Spanish. And once we turn on the interpretation, after I'm done saying this in Spanish, you're going to see a world map that is going to pop up at the bottom of your screen. Or if you are on your phone or tablet, you're going to see 3 little dots where it says more. There you will select language and then choose your language. If you are fully bilingual in English and in Spanish, you don't have to select any language, but if not, please do so that you can hear in the language of your heart. I do remind everybody to speak at a conversational pace. English is 20 to 25% longer than Spanish, so it takes me longer to say everything in the other language, so please stretch your words. If at some point you're speaking too fast and I need you to slow down so that I can catch up, I'm going to turn on my camera and I'm going to make this sign. It means stretch your words, slow down. Please remain muted when you're not speaking and speak very close to your microphone when it's your turn to speak. If you have any questions about interpretation, please ask them in the chat. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Andrea, estoy aquí con la Community Language Cooperative. Vamos a estar practicando la justicia del lenguaje en este espacio donde todos puedan hablar y escuchar en el idioma en el que se sienten más cómodos. Vamos a tener interpretación simultánea en inglés y en español, y una vez que aprendamos la interpretación en Zoom, ustedes van a ver un mapamundo en la parte inferior de su pantalla, o si están en su teléfono o tableta van a ver 3 punticos donde dice more o más, y ahí van a seleccionar su idioma. Si son bilingües en inglés y en español, no tienen que hacerlo. Les recuerdo a todos de que hablen a un paso conversacional, que se mantengan en silencio cuando no estén hablando, perdón, y que hablen muy cerca a su micrófono cuando sea su turno de hablar. Si tienen alguna pregunta sobre la interpretación, pueden hacerla en el chat. And host, we can begin interpretation now.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Welcome everybody. My name is Creighton Hoffitz. I'm just getting over a cold right now, so I'm a little bit stuffy, and hopefully that doesn't affect things too much. Please let me know if you have trouble hearing me, or if you need me to repeat anything. And I think and this is my first time doing a webinar with Doug, and so we might run into a little hiccup here, but I'm going to try and focus a lot of this session on question and answer. I've definitely got a presentation to start where I'm going to try and download as much information as I can. And then after that, I'm going to aim to try and do that within about 30 minutes to give at least 25 minutes for questions, because I think that especially with this topic, specific questions and specific situations that you all might be encountering or wondering about are going to give us the most kind of information and make this the most relevant that it can be. So my name is Creighton Hoffitz. I am the Director of Permaculture and Perennials for Denver Urban Gardens. I am the head of our Food Forest Initiative, and that's kind of where this comes from. Is for a long time, Doug has only been focused on annuals and community gardens, and we're expanding into perennials and food forests. And so as part of this, we want to expand our offerings around education that relates to trees and perennials. So I think we can get into we can do the next slide here. I suppose I don't think I can control it, right? There we go. So Doug is, as I said, primarily made up of community gardens, over 190 around the metro area. We are the largest independent community gardening organization in the country. And we have been able to serve a lot more people than just through gardening. There are education offerings in schools, in community workshops like this, at volunteer events. And we find that our community gardens and food forests help us to create nodes and networks of more interaction and learning. So you can see here our vision, our mission, and our values. And you know, I probably won't read all of it out loud, but it's really important to us to galvanize our community and to increase the empowerment that everyone has in their own particular context and whatever they want to accomplish. So Denver Urban Gardens and its staff and board honor the land on the unceded and stolen territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Oseti-Sakowin, and many other tribes that have ties to this region. We, at the very least, want our stewardship of this land to be reflective of regenerative principles, and we want to work and has our strong intention to continue to grow our work, dismantling ongoing legacies of oppression and inequities, and recognizing and partnering with current and future contributions of Indigenous communities. All right, so I'm going to dive right in with talking about the situation that we're in. We're talking about how to select trees, fruit trees and berry bushes especially, so food producing perennials, which ones will grow well here, and then where to put them in the landscape. So in order to do that, we have to think about where we are. We are in what's called a continental climate, which has these really quick transitions between seasons. And it gets very cold, and it also gets quite hot. When it does rain or snow, a lot of times it's in really large amounts. We don't have many days of drizzle or just light snow, although it seems like we might have one tomorrow. And we can also look to other places in the world that are very similar: Ukraine, Afghanistan, Northern China, Mongolia. We'll come back to that in a moment, but it's helpful sometimes to look to other places in the world that have the same climate that you have, so you can start to understand how what things you might be able to borrow from their cultivation practices. Go to the next slide. So this is going to become important because we're talking about perennials. I imagine that many people might be familiar with this map, but some might not be. This is the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone map. And this talks about minimum temperatures. So if you see on the right here, it really reflects the zone 1A, it gets down to -60. That's the coldest minimum temperature. That's in some places in Alaska. But if you go down to say maybe 8B, the coldest it ever gets is 15 to 20 degrees. So this might vary from year to year, and the climate is changing. But if you go to the next slide, we have a zoom in on Colorado. So Colorado ranges from 3A to 7A. And you'll notice that the only parts that are 7A are on the western side, Grand Junction, and then down by Durango a little bit. And a lot of the high country is much colder, of course. But right here in Denver, and I guess I saw that some people are in El Paso County and some people are in Boulder, along the Front Range, we have several pockets of zone 6A, which means it typically gets down to -10 degrees. It might have this year was an exceptionally cold winter, and I think I saw some things of potentially -13 in some areas. And so there can be a little bit of flux there, but generally I think of Denver as being a zone 6 and a lot of the Front Range areas. And this is important because this is talking about the minimum temperature, or basically certain plants can survive certain conditions. And usually it's determined by this. So a lemon tree won't survive because it can't handle the colder temperatures. So whenever we're looking for our perennials and whatever we can plant here, we're going to start by seeing, is it a zone 6 or lower plant, right? So some plants you'll see that they can survive down to zone 3 or 2, and those could survive here. But we can't have anything here that would be a zone 7, 8, 9, 10. That's how to read that. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So in addition to the Colorado climate, there are particular things about the Front Range climate where we are at. And I'll get to this later, but this is why we think about Colorado peaches as being a big thing. But peaches are not a great option for the Front Range. We have a pretty distinct climate in that way from the Western Slope on the opposite sides of the Continental Divide. We have these very late spring frosts here. So in April, late April, early May, we can still get frosts, and that will kill the blooms, the blossoms on our fruit trees. That's one big thing that's relevant to this. We can always have hail through a lot of the growing season. And we also have more wind than a lot of other places. As we open up into the plains, we'll have storm winds that'll come from the west, winds that sweep up and down. So that can be an issue in some areas as well. We can go to the next slide. So this is part of a resource that you can find by looking up the Michigan State University Extension bud development stages. But this is showing an example of apples and pears, and it's showing the fact that as they start to bloom more and more, they are less resistant to cold temperatures. So you can see there on the left, this is kind of what the buds look like on the fruit tree, and they can actually handle quite a bit of cold even when they're starting to open, right? At the tight cluster, it can be maybe 27 degrees, 24 degrees, and not really have any kill, any of the blossoms die. But what happens to us is that if the fruit trees bloom all the way up to, the first bloom or full bloom, and then it gets to 28, 27, 25 degrees, where we have a kind of a harder frost, we lose a lot of those blossoms, and then we lose the fruit. So this is what it is for apples and pears. It's significantly, well, it's similar kind of staging for other kinds of fruit. But this means that the bloom time, like when the trees are actually blossoming, is a really big deal for fruit trees here in Denver. We can go to the next. So other things to think about in our urban area, we have the urban heat island effect. So it might be a zone 6 here in Denver, but a lot of places are even a little bit warmer because buildings and roads hold on to heat and will raise the overall temperature. We have a lot of diversity. So from yard to yard, you actually have a lot of different kinds of plants packed into a dense area. So in some cases, we have a lot more diversity here than in some rural areas. We also have a lot of runoff from stormwater because we have roofs and roads and sidewalks and sewers, and so we have a lot of stormwater that can be an issue here. And as we'll get to, high diversity can mean more vectors for disease. Go next. Oops, that's a typo. Any plant can be grown as an annual if the growing season's long enough. Like I said, perennials need to be able to survive the winter. Also, annuals you need to water more frequently, but once they're established, perennials can survive a month or two of no precipitation. So they're a really good option for a climate resilient crop and a way to grow food. And then the last point here is that sometimes perennials can live in a place, but will almost never or never actually produce fruit. Apricot is an example of that. I heard of an apricot producing fruit recently, but I've never seen it here in Denver. We can go to the next. So when we're thinking about this in terms of site analysis, where you are looking to plant the tree, whether it's your yard or at your school or any kind of site, the things that I want you to think about more so is the conditions and the patterns of use. So the conditions on the site are, where is it very exposed and where is it more shady? How close are buildings to certain things? Where are the paths, sidewalks, and roads, and where does water flow? When it rains, go out and watch, and where does the water actually pool and run off to? And then in terms of patterns of use, it's like, especially if you're planting in a place where you're going to be, you should analyze, where do you actually go day to day? All right, so where are you accessing several times a day, and where do you actually not go to very often? This is all built on permaculture design techniques of site analysis. That is largely the sort of discipline that I come from in talking about this. And I've got some examples of what this can look like at a home design next. Oops, never mind. It's not next. But so what we're looking for here is, generally for fruit trees, don't plant them in a place where they're going to shade out your annual vegetables. Annual vegetables like a lot of sun, an exposed area, and if it's flat, like that should be a place for your gardens, maybe. Try not to shade those out in time. You can put fruit trees in places where they're kind of out of the way, on the edges of your fence, on the edges of a schoolyard or an area, a place that, because you don't have to access them as often as other things. The biggest thing is you want to find cool microclimates. So that means shady places. So north-facing slopes, east-facing slopes, the north side of the building, because we want to delay that bloom time. And then also try to make use of passive runoff. Slopes are great for this. It's hard to do anything else on a slope, but if you can plant some trees, you can get a lot of food out of that. Here we go. So this is, we don't have to go into everything that's on this map, but this is the map that I did of my house here. It's right at the center. And you can see the yellow areas are areas it's south facing. There's more sun, there's more exposure. To the north of the house, there's more shade. And so I'm trying, and then I can also see where the winds come from here. The top and bottom arrows are that. And I also have some blue arrows that are showing where water is flowing off of the driveway there, out of certain gutters or out of certain downspouts at the house. And so that was, that's one of the first things you can do, is what's actually going on here at the site to find the right spot for it. We can go to the next one. And this is a permaculture concept called zones, and this is patterns of use. So the one where it's darkest is the place that I use most often. The time is it's going out to the car, driving off to the job, coming back. So that commuting pathway. And then 2, I don't go there as often. 3, less often. So it's kind of figuring out, like, where are the places that I, use a lot and don't use as much. And then the next slide is everything combined. So if you put all that on top of each other, you can start to see, and you're thinking, well, what's something that's a little out of the way and has some water flow to it and is shady and cool. So I put all of the fruit trees that I planted, pretty much, except for some exceptions, all the major fruit trees I put on the north side of the house there, where there was water flowing to it, kind of in that zone between 1 and 2, along that driveway there, is where I planted all the fruit trees at my house, because I figured that this is where they're going to survive, but they're also going to fruit more consistently. There's an apple tree that was planted before I moved in here. That's in the sort of south east corner of the yard where it's very exposed. And it often has issues with blooming too early. It has disease issues. It's very exposed, and it doesn't always fruit consistently. We can go to the next. All right, so we're going to get into species here, and I'll try to be mindful of Andrea translating, but also not get too stuck in this. So when we're looking at trees here, most of the trees I'm going to be recommending are not native. They are, most of the plants that we get food from are not indigenous to Colorado or North America. Most of the stuff you'll find in the grocery store, but because they've actually been domesticated. And they've been bred a certain way. Many of them come from Europe or Asia. And then, but I also am curious about plants that are adapted. So plants that thrive really well in our region, don't box out other species. That's another thing that we can be going for. Native plants do often have more beneficial interactions with local pollinators, but usually their fruit is much smaller and less prolific. We can go to the next one. These are the major fruit trees that we're selecting and using at Doug Food Forests. And we're going to be selling some extra of these at our plant sale. And the pre-order for that is going to go up hopefully within the next week, because we have some selected varieties of these. But we do apple, European pear, plum, cherry, Asian pear, peach, persimmon, jujube, mulberry, and then hazelnut, which hazelnut is not a fruit tree, it's a nut tree, but it's one of the main trees that we use. It's really the main nut that is viable in Colorado. Most others aren't. So within these, I think the apple and pear, the apples and pears need to be fire blight resistant in Denver. I mean, you could plant other ones. Fire blight is a really common disease here. There are lots of good fire blight resistant varieties, and that's what we're ordering for our food forests and that we'll have for sale. There are some for sale, and you can find different references to this. But there's just so much of the fire blight disease around that you're going to lose a lot of trees before if you're not looking to do that. I said, Asian pear and peach are especially needed to be in cool microclimates because they bloom really early. Jujube, mulberry, and hazelnut at the bottom are really good examples, really good for kind of hot and exposed areas because they're not affected by the late frosts in the same way. Yeah, we can go on to the next one. These are some of the berries that we are also going to have for sale and be using, and some of the ones I recommend. These are good companion plants and berries. Currant, yostaberry, honeyberry, bush cherry, elderberry, serviceberry, aronia, blackberry. We use thornless blackberry. There's several different kinds, and boysenberry. I really love serviceberries. They're a delicious crop. They're native. They're one of the good crossovers of a native plant that can bear really prolifically, and also and it tastes really good. And they have different sizes and different sort of characteristics. The honeyberry is one that you would only want to put underneath something else. So you want to be in kind of a shady, especially cool zone because they can get very exposed and they don't do well in hot situations. And then currant and yostaberry, bush cherry, they're all really good, relatively low growing. The bush cherry can get a little bit bigger, but they're relatively low growing and can produce a lot of fruit. And these are all really good in conjunction with fruit trees. So putting them near them so that you have kind of a fruit zone, perennial zone. It's good to put them in the same area. We can go to the next one. And then I won't go through all of these, but these are some of the good companion plants that we use. The top 5 there on the list are more nitrogen fixing plants that help to improve the soil. And then the bottom are herbaceous perennials that I think are good ones to combine with fruit trees, and they'll come back every year and they can still be edible. But this part of the list gets really huge. You could go on and on and on about lots of different things. So since we're going to try and focus on trees, we won't go too much into this, but I can answer questions about this later. So the other thing is when we're thinking about where we're putting our trees, we have to think about how big they're eventually going to be. Standard size fruit trees can be 35 feet tall and 35 feet wide. You'll see these names at the nursery semi-dwarf and dwarf. And that means that the root stock that the tree is grafted to, it's been bred to be smaller, right? But the way that they are smaller is that they have reduced vigor, which means their root systems are not as strong, they're not as aggressive. I take my recommendation from Michael Bronner at Harlequin's Nursery in Boulder, who always recommend, and I agree at this point, to get standard sized trees and then control them with pruning, because they're going to dig into the soil, they're going to be better protected against the wind, and they're going to punch through our clay soil better. And they're, so we really want tough plants here. So I think that finding standard size fruit trees and then pruning them back and controlling them that way is going to give you more success in the long run. We usually give 15-foot spacing. I'll show you a diagram from one of our food forests in a moment. So eventually that means that you would be constraining the tree with some summer pruning, and that gets into different techniques, but this is what I would recommend. Now, I will say, if you don't think you're going to be able to prune anything, and you're not going to be there, if you're not going to be in a situation where you can give active maintenance to this tree, then maybe you do select something smaller, because you don't want to plant something and then give somebody else a big hassle when that tree grows way farther, over the fence and into other trees. So you want to think about the human situation. You want to understand, is this something that's going to be able to be maintained over time? Or is it something that we're going to plant and go? It's a little bit less for cherries and hazelnuts. I'll demonstrate that in a minute. In fact, I might. Yeah, here we go. So this is a diagram. You can find lots of different ones talking about apple rootstocks. And so these all have these weird names. But the idea, though, is that when you find semi-dwarfing and dwarfing rootstocks, they're all based on a smaller percentage of the standard size tree. This says a standard size tree is 25 feet, but I've definitely seen apple trees that are bigger than 25 feet tall, and more than 25 feet around. But this is the idea, is that how there can be variation. And this is true of all fruit trees. And you can see that referenced on the tag at the nursery, and you can look for that. You can go to the next one. It's a little small the way it ended up here. This is a draft diagram for one of our, I don't know if there's a way to zoom in on it at all, but and it's fine if not. I wanted to kind of demonstrate all the biggest circles here are 15 feet across. Yeah, it didn't, oops. Yeah, it didn't affect the sizing on our end. That's okay. Thanks, Caroline. The biggest circles are 15 feet across. Then there's some smaller ones. They're cherries. Oh, you can. Thanks, Linda. I saw it. You can zoom in. That's great. The smaller, slightly smaller circles are cherries. I'm only giving them 12 feet across. We have small bushes that I'm giving 6 feet. And then at the bottom left there, you can see a row of hazelnuts that I'm giving 10 feet. So this is a way of diagramming for yourself how big they'll be at maturity. It's going to take a long time for them to be there, but you do want to know how much space they're going to take up when they are mature. And you just have to give that spacing and trust that the tree will fill in. Because if you don't give that spacing, the trees are going to grow into each other, and they're going to start to get tangled, and they're going to be more disease prone as well, as their branches intermingle, and give you more of a hassle in terms of pruning them. So I think diagramming it out like this is a helpful tool. Use a scale and try and think far into the future. I wouldn't expect these trees to be this big for at least 10 or 15 years, though. So it takes a while. We can go to the next. Yeah, so the other thing when you're thinking about siting them, trees need to be pollinated to set fruit. Some of them, like apples, pears, and hazelnuts, they cannot fruit without a different variety. So if you put only Honeycrisp apples, out, they're not going to actually produce any apples because they're the same type. You need to have different types to cross-pollinate. You'll see this thing at nurseries where a plant is labeled as self-fertile so that they don't need a pollinator, which is true on some trees, but I think it's best to plant multiples of any tree that you have because they're just so much more productive when they have a pollinizer around. So a lot of nut trees here, it says, are wind pollinated, so they have to be near each other to have the wind blow, whereas fruit trees are pollinated by insects. This note is something I learned recently. It's so cool that jujubes, which is a plant from Mongolia and northern China, they're pollinated by ants. So that means that the ants have to crawl up the trunk of one tree, go into the blossoms, and then crawl down and go over to the other one. So if you're getting jujubes, which I think is a fantastic new potential crop for dry lands like Colorado, you actually need to have them really close together for them to be able to be pollinated. Fire blight, fire blight in rural places, you can control it by just not having any trees that have fire blight and removing it when it shows up. But the odds are that you're gonna have a tree a block away or 2 houses away that has fire blight, maybe a crabapple tree, maybe some other thing. And so for apples and pears, it's really important to find resistant varieties. You can also prune it, but it's there's just a lot of it around. So we don't have as many options for varieties of those plants as you might in a rural orchard. But yeah, the flip side, as I said, is that probably if you have a very small yard, you probably can get away with planting an apple because there's going to be an apple somewhere else in your neighborhood that a bee can carry pollen to and from. This is a chart that you'll see in a lot of places and you'll see different versions that different nurseries will carry, where you'll see that this, certain types can be pollinated by other types, and that's usually based on bloom time, but it's also this compatibility thing. So you'll want to look at charts from nurseries about this. Although, again, I've never seen this be a problem in an urban area because there's just so much pollen around and different kinds of species that you don't need to worry about that as much, but it is a good thing to be aware of. Wow. All right. So we can go back to any of these slides. I wanted to get through that first without stopping for questions in case I was going to answer the questions. But at this point, I would love to take some specific questions. It can be about your situation, or it can be about like, hey, I need to go back to that variety slide, or I need to go back to something that I was talking about. Would love to hear from you.
I'd also just love to add really quickly that you can either put your questions into the Q&A function or the chat function, or if you'd like to just speak, I can unmute you and make sure that you're able to just speak in the Zoom itself. So let me know if you'd like to have a longer back and forth, and I can bump you up into the into the speaking role on the Zoom.
Great. Amy, I saw that question. I think yes, I'd be happy to provide a copy of this. Yeah, to all the participants. Thanks for asking that. Christy's asking, what are your thoughts on starting fruit trees in large pots here in Colorado? Christy, do you mean that in terms of starting a tree in a large pot because you know you're going to move and then moving with it, or can you expand on that a little bit?
So basically, we don't have very consistent sunlight throughout our yard. We have a very lush, natural barrier on 3 of the 4 sides of our home, which is beautiful, but it's preventing us from getting a good crop of regular vegetables and strawberries, different things like that. And so what I noticed last year in my first year of gardening was that I had to move things in pots a lot just to get it the proper sunlight. And everything that I had in a garden bed that was even partially shaded didn't flourish. So I'm wondering if fruit trees are even a possibility in our yard, given the inconsistent sunlight because of the lush barrier.
They are. I think that that sounds like a lot of effort. I would say
Yeah.
it sounds like a lot to kind of move to that. I would think about trying to find berries and companions that that can thrive in shaded areas. So get some honeyberries. Currants do okay in the shade. So if we're trying to find at least partial shade. I think that the fruit trees will survive in large pots, but just moving them around, that they'll be big and heavy. I don't know that you'll get what you want out of that. Another thing that, thank you for this question, because I forgot to mention, there's another fruit that's native to North America that can grow here, but it really requires an especially sheltered microclimate. It's called pawpaw. And that sounds like you should look up some pawpaw. I'll just type that into the, it's like the North American version of a mango. It's this really interesting custardy fruit, and it really thrives. It can only be kind of in the shade of other larger trees because it's so vulnerable to overheating and getting sunburned. So check that out. I think that's maybe what I would recommend there, rather than engineering this other fix. Amy says, I have 2 peach trees on the northwest side of my backyard that have not made peaches for some time, maybe 2 years. Starting over with new trees or to figure out what is going wrong with the trees. Amy, do the peach trees bloom? Do they set blossoms? Oh,
They do
hey, Amy.
bloom. They bloom for a minute. I'm on my phone, sorry, with the audio.
No, you're good.
They
You're
do
good.
bloom.
Yeah, this is the thing. Even in a microclimate, they can still have some problems. I don't know how old they are, but I think the con is just that it is time. It's going to take a long time for new trees to get large enough to start producing fruit, and that's, it's I think that's just, it's hard for me to determine that, other than saying that will kind of happen with peaches. I do think there's some possibility to create a microclimate. Like, what about putting even more shade, like a little barrier, a pallet fence or something, to the south side of it to cool it down even more? I think
What's
that would be
interesting about that is that there's a small room that gives the trees shade on the south side, coincidentally.
Huh.
And the bigger tree, we've had that house for since 2005, and the trees were already there, and
oh, wow.
they're pretty much the same size. So they're definitely way over 18 years now.
Wow.
Old.
Yeah, it's
What is
hard.
the
I mean,
lifespan?
but peaches are shorter lived than other trees. They'll live 30 to 40 years, whereas apples and pears can be 80 or 100 years old. So I think that, yeah, that's tough. Also, it's possible peaches can be started from the peach pits. It's possible somebody started it from those, and they might just not be, and that can be kind of a random variety. But also, even there, no fruit on peaches for 2 years is not, it's pretty common in Denver, that you might only get fruit every 1 out of 3 or 4 years. So I think that can be kind of up to you. Sorry, I can't give more guidance, but that is a tough
I
thing.
definitely need
yeah.
to investigate more for my personal situation. I don't want to get rid of them, and I think they still have more life to give. But I definitely need to look really hard into it and research what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't usually recommend taking out trees because they've done all the work to grow. But depending on the space and situation that might come up. I see, let me see, it sounds like there's a question from Rachel talking about soil prep and how to best set the tree up for success. It also looks like Sharona had a question that was similar. I think, so when we plant our trees, we're planting with some compost, but not planting with fertilizer or any kind of manure. We want the tree to send out its roots, and if you give it too much nutrients at first, it won't have any reason to send out the roots and find more. And you can fertilize your trees with a top dressing of compost or aged manure. I'll get back. There's more stuff we do when we plant, but so you can add that aged manure, should be fine. I tend to think that I just try to add lots of wood chips, organic material, and not worry about fertilizing my fruit trees in as much, partly just because I'd rather put that stuff towards my annual vegetables. And if you just keep building the soil with wood chips, organic material, they'll kind of make some of their own fertility. It'd be different in an orchard situation where you're trying to maximize lots of fruit. The other thing, Rachel, that we do with soil, we want to break up some of the area around where we're planting so that we can minimize soil compaction, because most of a tree's roots are actually in the top 6 inches. It doesn't just go down, it spreads far out. So loosening the soil, mulching very far out from where you're planting, much farther than you would see in a park tree. And then the other thing that I think is probably the most important to add is mycorrhizal fungi. You can get that inoculant at most nurseries and garden stores, and sprinkle a little bit of that on the roots, because that will introduce the roots to the fungal network around it, and that will kind of help the most. I see, okay, we go back into the Linda. Curious about starting a hazelnut in proximity to a Concord grapevine. About 6 feet away, it'd be located on the northeastern side of yard. I'm trying to picture this. I don't think that's too bad. I mean, if it's only shading until 9, I don't think that's that big of a deal. One thing though is that hazelnuts, I didn't talk about Japanese beetles. They are definitely a big pest for our fruit trees. And although they really like the grapes the most, they'll also like hazelnuts quite a bit. So you might end up with a thing where you have lots of Japanese beetles, and they'll have more on the hazelnut because because it's so close to the Concord grape. We can use grapes to distract the Japanese beetles and draw them away from fruit trees. This is why I'm not planting any grapes in our food forests. Let's see, yeah. So Tasha asks, what should be planted first when creating? I see, like what should you do first? I think I would plant your tree first. In a natural order of succession, you would have grasses and weeds, and then small shrubs, and then bigger shrubs, and then eventually you'd have a tree, and that would happen over hundreds of years as it kind of as a natural ecosystem develops. But I think you can plant the tree first. I also think a tree can help to anchor yourself. So you say, here's the tree, it's going to be about this big, and then you can start filling in other plants around it. You know, so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll plant a fruit tree, a nitrogen fixer, and a berry bush, kind of as a three plant grouping, and then we can add other things over time. It's always better to have more plants and to keep that going, but I wouldn't worry about doing too much to prepare, because we want to get these trees going. What direction should honeyberry be shaded? I planted one last year. Seems like it might be too sunny there. So, I mean, you really want to shade a honeyberry from the south and the west. So you want to plant honeyberries. If you have your tree, we're looking north. Oh, this is going to be flipped on the screen maybe. But you want to plant your honeyberries to the north side of your fruit trees, and even if possible to the northeast side, because then they'll get the most shading and protection from the really punishing western and southern sun. Sharona asks if it's too late to prune fruit trees. It's not. You can prune fruit trees actually, because of this cold winter, it looks like we're getting even more time to prune, because you just want them to be dormant. And I'll even prune some things when they're just starting to open up, but mostly we do pruning when the tree is dormant. The exception to that, Sharona, is when I talked about topping a tree to keep it small in an urban area. So if you buy a standard tree and it's going to be huge, but you want it to be smaller, is you want to go in July and do a summer pruning and cut off, kind of give it a haircut, and that will actually stunt the tree and keep it smaller. So that's only if you want to do a stunting or a dwarfing action on your tree. But now is totally fine to prune. Yeah. More questions, please keep them coming if you got them. Lilac tree. Oh, great. These are both good questions. Lilac tree near where we were planting. I don't think there's any problems with lilac, although I feel like I heard somebody say that they saw fire blight on a lilac and that it was a disease vector to fruit trees. But I think I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would just think, Tasha, about trying to keep your fruit trees from being in a position where they'll grow into the lilac tree. Because eventually that'll just conflict and it won't be good for either of them. Nanking cherry is actually, I should add it to the list. We should be putting a few of those in at our food forest. That's a great, depending on the cultivar, that can be kind of sometimes they get as large as a small tree. And that's a cool one that is much more adapted and hardy. Those cherries are just a little bit smaller and a little bit tarter than even a tart cherry tree. Dense shade on the southern side of my yard. Ooh, bushes, shrubs from your list of work. Dense shade, it's a little bit, as I mentioned to Christy, pawpaws are a cool thing to put in there. They become a full tree. Honeyberries will probably do all right. I don't know about, and currants can survive. Currants they like sun and they'll produce more berries in sun, but currants can work well in shade. That's actually why we'll plant a fruit tree and then a currant bush, because as the tree grows, the currant will still produce under the canopy of the tree. But other than that, I would start to look at maybe other herbaceous things, and a plant called sweet Sicily is a great one that it's not a tree or a bush, but it's a great little licorice edible plant. Shade is tough, and also if it's on the southern side, it might even be dry and shady, which is one of the hardest situations. One thing I didn't say, which it's the thing I say first always. If we get much snow tomorrow, look around as it starts to melt, and the place that everywhere where the snow stays the longest is the best place for your fruit tree. especially now. So in an April snow, just check out where the snow sticks around. And if it stays there, that's your coolest, shadiest spot. And that's where you would want to put a fruit tree. That's a good way to do that without doing all this like kind of larger design and analysis. Just if you've got an open spot that does get sun eventually, but keeps the snow around, that's where you want to plant. Yeah. Other questions? I hope I'm answering these ones well enough. Elderberry does not get fire blight. Sharona asked that. Yeah, really, I've heard of it in some other things, but it's really primarily a danger to the apples and pears. Elderberries are great, and most of the berries, you know, they're going to produce a lot faster than the trees. A couple of the berries, so elderberry and aronia especially, really thrive on with more water. So if you have any kind of a drainage area, or if you have a gray water system, I don't know, you wouldn't have a gray water system, would you, Sharona? I know, Sharona, that's fine I'm saying. But those are really good spots for elderberries and aronias. They kind of really water loving plants, and they'll thrive in that. Zoning regulations, I'm not aware of any zoning regulations where you can plant a tree, Amy. I would, I think there's something about when a tree hangs over a fence, like your neighbor could chop off the parts that are over their fence, but I don't know that very well. I haven't looked into those laws. I probably should. I tend to just plant and go for it. But I don't know of any explicit zoning regulations on trees. You do want to be careful about overhead wires. So thinking about trying to plant something that might be a little bit smaller so that you're not going to have to fight it going into, you know, phone lines or wires all the time. Yeah. It takes a little while for the question to get typed in, so I'll wait a little bit more. Yes, thank you, Sharona. That was actually something that was on my mind to bring up. Sewage pipes, water pipes, and foundations. So depending on the plant, some are more aggressive than others, but if we're looking for an aggressive plant, we could have issues with that. I think plums are probably the most aggressive in terms of roots to look out for, but you should check and see what your sewer pipe is made out of. Newer sewer pipes coming out from the house are PVC, and you can plant over them and it doesn't matter. Older pipes, so I actually did that here at my place. My house is 100 years old, and it had a ceramic sewer pipe. And so I replaced that because it was running right through where I wanted to do all of my trees. And so I decided to replace that section of my sewer pipe with a PVC pipe, and then you won't have that issue. But it's true on older houses with a sewer, it'll work their way in there. And the same thing next to a foundation. Tasha says, when's the best time to plant? I would not plant in midsummer. You can, but it just gets so hot here that you're gonna stress your tree out. Our planting window at Doug is basically mid-April to end of May. And then we start up again in sort of late August and then early September. And there's also a fall planting window. So you might look at that, Tasha's, wait till it gets a little bit later in the season. I think it's actually best to not plant too far into like late September or early October, because the roots need time to get established before we get our quick, sometimes very heavy freezes in October. But I wouldn't plant trees in June, July, or early August. And I also really appreciate all these questions because this is the first time I've done this particular kind of presentation. And this is helping me think about how to arrange the information in the future and how to make this better. Yeah, any other questions here? Okay. So Kimberly, I would not say I'm an expert on pruning raspberries. I actually we're not planting raspberries in our food forest, although we are going to have a bunch of raspberries for sale this year at Doug, like 200 bare root raspberries. Partly because raspberries can really spread, and they just like spread by suckering. But essentially, after a raspberry cane fruits, you can snip it off at the ground. So they fruit on second year wood. So they'll come up, and then the next year, another one comes up, and this first one is fruiting. And then after you get the fruit off at the end of that year, you prune this one out, and then this one fruits, and then another one comes up. That's the kind of the basics that I know for raspberries. But I know it can be also a little bit different. I don't have as much experience about that with some of the different types. Fruit bush. So for so Japanese beetles seem to like grapevines and Virginia creeper vines the most, but apples aren't far behind. So the Japanese beetles tend to they'll really like apples, and even some varieties of apples they like more. And in fact, so most of the fruit trees that we use, all the ones I'm talking about are, I don't know about jujube, they're all in the rose family. And so Japanese beetles also love rose bushes. So they love rose family foliage. I have not seen them on fruit or like on fruit, like berry bushes and shrubs, Linda, in the same way that I've seen them on trees. But I was also surprised to see how much they liked hazelnuts. So I don't know. They're pretty ravenous. Yeah. Any other questions here?
Great. And I think if you're okay with staying on for a couple more minutes for more questions, that's fantastic. But for those who do need to leave, I will just share that we will be sure to send an email with this PowerPoint as a follow-up, as well as the link to the pre-order form for trees that will be available in conjunction with the spring plant sale. So expect those follow-up resources. And if you'd like to stay on a couple more minutes, then I think Creighton and I can both stick around.
Yeah, I can stay on for a bit. I'll also put in a quick pitch for the Denver Permaculture Design course, which is run in conjunction with Doug. And that's starting in early May, and we still have spots available. That's kind of where I'll come from with all this kind of right spacing and relationship and understanding that. So interested in the permaculture course, check that out as well. It's on our website. Yeah, it's been fun to talk so far. But yeah, please, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit longer and answer any questions that people have. Or at least attempt to answer, I will say. Okay.
All right.
That's pretty good.
Forwarding.